Now, this is demonstrated in the examples I've mentioned, where amateurs repurpose household items in innovative and creative ways, which were not usually how those things were originally intended to be used. And the early days of radio experimentation soon showed that different wavelengths exhibited different properties, and that other factors such as time of day, weather, and sunspot cycles had additional impact on radio wave propagation, which is the ability of radio waves to travel over greater distances. So these explorations in the physical science and the affordances of the radio spectrum were largely undertaken by amateur experimenters. And this all sits well with Gibson's own discussion of affordance, that it is neither objective nor subjective, but both. So it's important to note that affordance is a relationship not residing in any entity itself. It's in the relationship. Let's go back to my slide. Because I'm arguing that social, technical, and natural physics of radio waves are all actors and are equally necessary in amateur radio participation, I'm adopting actor network theory to complement affordance in theorising my research into amateur radio networks. Actor network theory provides ways of thinking about how networks of people and things carry influence and influence each other, foregrounding the ways in which people and things are made to act across geographical, temporal, or institutional boundaries. That's a quote from Tummins. Of particular relevance to amateur radio are the interactions of people and things, the materiality, and these three concerns that might all be effectively described as boundaries: geographical, temporal, and institutional, which could also include nation states, national and international regulatory bodies such as ACMA and the IRAU and things like that. In actor network theory, it's possible to have a network which is lacking hierarchy. As Bruno Latour says, there is no top and bottom in a network. So this effectively describes a network like the internet or amateur radio, where there's not really any one node that is any more or less important than any other node. But it does neglect issues of power and politics, and that's something I will address in my project. But currently, I'm just concerned with the material semiotic relationship or entanglement, to use the term, between amateur radio practitioners and the things or technologies they employ. These amateur networks, being mediated by both radio and social interactions, are ephemeral, and therefore the relations must be performed again and again to create and recreate the network, which is both social technology and material technology. Okay, so from the start, radio communication was about distance. Marconi's wireless was envisaged as a telecommunication medium, a direct replacement for the electrically wired telegraph, which was point to point. This is Susan Douglas, again, she's a great scholar in the US writing on radio. She says, Marconi concentrated on selling wireless to major commercial customers such as steamship companies and newspapers with already established needs for such a device. He was offering what was then wishfully, yet too narrowly referred to as point-to-point communication between specific senders and receivers. He was not marketing the device to individuals, and he did not conceive of transmitting voice or music. Broadcasting was simply not part of his scheme. And this is a little thing from the Mail in Adelaide, saying that even in 1924, we can see he was still trying to deal with this problem, as he saw it, of people being able to listen in on radio broadcasts. So wireless telegraphy had the advantages of not requiring long runs of cable between 2 points, and that the technology could be used while mobile. So it suited Marconi's affordances. Those affordances suited Marconi's need to maintain contact with ships at sea. However, the new medium of wireless was not like wired telegraphy in other important respects. So it lacked secrecy, and it lacked a bit of reliability as well. But we can see here this bit from the Mail that Marconi in 1924, by which time broadcast was already getting underway, said he's still trying to deal with this problem of secrecy and trying to create a wireless system where you could send messages without the whole world listening in. But these two problems, as they were seen, secrecy and reliability, it's these two characteristics of wireless telegraphy that provided a foundation for amateur radio and continue to be exploited by amateur radio today. Under the interpretive flexibility of radio amateurs, these problems for official wired telegraphy became affordances of the medium, which allowed amateur radio to develop. In exploiting these affordances, amateurs demonstrated different applications of wireless. Instead of seeing it as point-to-point communication systems, amateurs showed that it was also useful as a one-to-many system, and thus, in doing that, they laid the foundations for radio broadcasting in the 20th century. Now, alongside the development of one-to-many mass broadcasting, the distinct amateur radio model of socializing over the air continued, as it had from the earliest days of the radio telegraphy era. And this amateur radio model was not like broadcasting and exhibited the qualities of a network. Now, just to bring it back to Australia, in Australia, the earliest detailed record shows wireless telegraphy was demonstrated by Professor William Bragg at the University of Adelaide in September 1897. That's within the year of Marconi's demonstration in London in 1896. And also the peak body representing amateur radio in Australia is the Wireless Institute of Australia, which formed in 1910, just 13 years later. And it is an umbrella organisation for the numerous local radio clubs that had all sprung up in support of local experimenters with this new medium of radio. Now, again, in actor network theory, this national agency represents an actor itself, consisting of a number of smaller actors in what's called punctualization. But I'll rather return to America. Writing in 1929, Hiram Maxim recalls the formation of their national amateur body, which is one of the largest amateur radio societies in the world, the American Radio Relay League. Maxim states the US Federal Radio Law of 1912 resulted in the publication of a call book showing that there were several thousand highly enthusiastic amateurs in the United States, outnumbering the number of government and commercial stations combined. Now, as in Australia, local amateur radio clubs were forming all over the United States to enthusiastically share information, support, and one assumes materials. And this was in a time when there were practically no books that handled the subject, and these clubs afforded information and training and all those sorts of self-guided learning experiences. At a meeting of the Radio Club at Hartford, the idea for forming a radio relay network across the country was proposed. And this is a direct quote from Hiram Maxim. He says, "I remember the evening very well. One young man had electrified the meeting by saying that he had established communication with the neighbouring town of Windsor Locks. Why could not Windsor Locks reach Springfield, Massachusetts? And if this could be done, why would it not be possible for an amateur in Hartford to send a message by relay to Springfield and possibly receive an answer back inside an hour? It was but a logical thing to take the next mental step, and that was to go beyond Springfield. Why not continue the scheme to Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and even to Albany? And why not expect the Albany fellows to work it out with the fellows of Utica? And what would stop them from getting all the way to Buffalo?" And then a wonderful conception came into the minds of these young men. Why not apply the relay idea to the entire United States? So in 1914, the American Radio Relay League became the national body linking all the radio clubs of the United States that stood for good organisation, good government, and good radio. And they introduced an efficient traffic system, which was just social rules about how to work stations. And that was implemented for the relaying of messages, and regular communication between New York, Chicago, and the Southwest became common. America's entry into the First World War saw the closing down of all amateur radio stations, which occurred internationally as it did in Australia. But after the war, in 1919, Maxim was able to send a transcontinental message coast to coast and receive a reply in just 6.5 minutes. That's in 1919. So we can see this little graphic here of sort of representation of an amateur radio network. But the practice of amateur radio relay networks had taken off in other countries too. In Australia, the Mail from Adelaide, South Australia, 1924 reported a relay route England to Australia. By the middle of the year, it's hoped to have a reliable relay route between England and Australia, and in that event, the King will be asked to send a message to the Governor-General through the amateur stations. Later on, it's hoped that as a result of the experience gained in the tests now under consideration, it will be possible to undertake direct reception of messages transmitted by English experimental stations. These relay networks demonstrate an affordance not of the technology or of the nature of radio waves, but of the sociality of amateur radio itself. I argue that recognising the potential of the radio clubs is another example of interpretive flexibility, and that it is an affordance of the sociality and organisations of these organisations and these clubs that made the relay network possible in overcoming the limitations of radio transmissions available to the amateur operators. So it's a combination of people and technology that make the network. Now, mass media broadcasts are centralised, as we know, monolithic, one-to-many, and there's no immediate return path to provide reciprocity to the receiver to reply or engage with the station. In contrast to this, amateur radio is decentralised, and a number of stations are able to interact in creating the content, while others might simply listen in. Like contemporary social media, amateur radio sends messages to one or to many, and the messages may be shared or passed on to others. There are many hundreds of amateur radio clubs around Australia currently, and most clubs conduct regular on-air nets, as they call them. And these are a chance for radio operators to meet people or to catch up with friends and discuss the events of the week. And the social interaction provided on these nets can be observed, as I have done at the Ipswich and District Radio Club, who have held several nets daily, including one in the morning at 8 a.m. on their local club repeater, which is just a centralised transmitter. Callers drop in and chat about activities, what they've been up to, or engage in conversation about the region where they work or live. Health and family matters, as well as projects and travel, are common themes. These are all things I've observed, obviously not so much during COVID. Travel's been a bit restricted, and I've been talking about that. In these on-air nets, each operator hands the conversation over to another or back to a central net controller. So there's an etiquette. And for the effective functioning of these nets, they operate along these implicit social rules. Callers leave space between transmissions so as to allow new people to join the group, and they limit their speech to a couple of minutes so as not to dominate the conversation. Now, as this repeater covers a large area of several hundred kilometres, some regular callers include farmers and people travelling to work who have mobile transceivers fitted into their vehicles. And the social network provided by the radio is such that it's common that if an operator is unwell, they'll say, oh, so-and-so is not on the net today because he's not well or something like that. And someone might go and drop in on them and see how they're going, or offer them assistance in some area if they need some help, like setting up an antenna or something like that. So while there are participants in the net, there are also many others who regularly listen in without broadcasting, and some operators make a habit of sending cheerio calls to those listeners. Local clubs also transmit networked content, such as news broadcasts from the national body, the WIA. In Australia, we also have a National Amateur Radio Emergency Response Network called WISEM, which is an acronym for the Wireless Institute Civil Emergency Service. And that consists of a number of state or territory-based autonomous bodies of amateur radio volunteers who are able to provide emergency and safety communications for other agencies when conventional communications networks fail or are inadequate. The provision of communications support may be during times of civil emergency, such as flood, fires and storms, but some WISEM groups also provide safety communications for public events such as marathons, bike rides and car rallies. Here again, we see values of community engagement and social responsibility come to the fore. So amateur radio has played a key role in emergency communications for communities during times of disaster, notably during Cyclone Tracy, when amateur radio was the only medium functioning. More recently, though, during bushfires, the earthquakes in Christchurch, and Japan's tragic tsunami. And there's some interesting papers about this. In the 21st century, with our reliance on electronic communication networks, are embedded in all aspects of modern life, and amateur radio may prove as useful in emergencies as it has done in earlier eras. Most of our digital communication networks, such as Wi-Fi and mobile phones, only operate over short distances. If there is some major crisis in which electricity supply is cut, then these communication networks would fail. Amateur radio networks not only allow two-way voice messages, but also data connections through packet radio systems, which are computers connected to the internet. You could use battery-operated computers like laptops, and these could be able to carry on if there were other disruptions to other networks. So there was an interesting article called "When All Else Fails, 21st Century Amateur Radio as an Emergency Communication Medium" by Noto, and they were arguing that amateur radio provides increasingly invaluable emergency distance communications for essential medical services which rely on modern digital communications technologies, blood banking and transfusion medicine, and all sorts of things like that. And so while we tend to think of amateur radio as something from the past, I want to use this as an example of how it's still very much present and how the networks are still very strong. So I've concluded that amateur radio is a media form manifestly combining both technological and social aspects as necessary for operation. It occupies that liminal space between person-to-person and mass broadcast media. And I argue that amateur radio is probably a little bit more analogous to socially generated media network that we're familiar with now than a mass broadcast medium. And I think understanding the sociality of amateur radio contributes to our broader understanding of socially mediated communication technologies and technological literacies in an era when our dominant media platforms are moving from centralized mass broadcast systems towards mediated networks of individuals engaging with rapid technological change and all the attendant frameworks of evolving regulations and etiquettes. I have a couple of photos here to share with you. There's some people out and about in parks. They have competitions where they'll go out into parks and what they call activate parks or mountains and things like that. A group of amateurs visiting a radio installation on Norfolk Island. That's the image on the right. This was from the Wireless Institute of Australia's national conference in 2018, I think this was, at the Gold Coast. As you can see in the top right, there's a big room full of people. Various other radio clubs were represented, and they're all sharing information and playing around with technology. So this fellow here is playing with you can see a parabolic dish there. They're actually bouncing radio messages off the moon, which was low on the horizon, to people in the Northern Hemisphere and sending messages backwards and forwards. Computers hooked up to that, so they were sending digital messages via computers. So there's a lot of this haptic playing with media that's still going on, as it has done from the earliest days of amateur radio. And that's it. I think I've gone well over my 20 minutes, Ashley.
We've got 5 minutes to go for the questions. Thank you, Andrew. But a wonderful presentation, and thank you for taking us into a different space within regional radio, and has opened up some deep thinking around what's going on in that space. So any questions from anyone in the room that we'd like to pick up right now? Please just open your mic and join in. Bridget.
Thanks, Ashley. Thanks for that, Andrew. Nice to see you and hear you. I wonder if you could say a little something about gender and these amateur clubs in the early years and more recently.
Yes, predominantly amateur radio was thought of as being mainly male. However, it isn't just male. And I was very interested in Donna Halper's presentation this morning, where she was looking at the hidden women in radio in America. And it made me think of Florence Violet Mackenzie, Australia's first electrical engineer. Went to uni, had to argue to get into uni to study electrical engineering. She was one of the first registered radio amateurs. She did a lot of amazing things. Started Wireless Weekly. There's a whole history of women in amateur radio as well. And in fact, there is a national body. There's lots of different national bodies. Within the WIA, there's subgroups too. So there's a Pride radio group for LGBTIQ plus people. There's a long-standing group called ALARA, which is Australian Ladies Amateur Radio Association, which I think has been going for a long time. So there's certainly a big network, and sometimes they form their own nets too and things like that, but they generally, everyone just mixes them together. And so there's nothing preventing anyone of any age, gender or ability from joining amateur radio. The only thing they have to do is pass exams. So as long as they can pass some exams and get a license, they can join. But predominantly, yes, it is predominantly male, and it's predominantly middle-aged and over. A great question. And I will look at gender. It's going to be one of the issues I'll probably look at later.
Actually, I hope you don't mind, if I could ask just a really quick follow-up. Andrew, is your PhD at UQ related to what you've spoken about today? Yes.
I've been tinkering with this. I think I've spoken with you before about these concepts I've had about this project, and it's sort of been on the back burner. And I started with with Tom Regan down there at UQ actually, and so that was very sad thing to lose Tom, obviously for everybody. And I'm now with Alex Bevan and Nick Carra, my supervisors. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, I was also just wanting to make maybe an observation, but also potentially a question will come, Andrew, is that I recall in a lot of the research that I've done just about the influence of amateur radio into broadcast radio, and in the early stages really helping to establish radio. And I think the thing that always sat with me was about the ingenuity and the creativity, innovation that happens from this group of people, that, you know, not only from that time, but also now in what you've shared today has really kind of just reminded me about that kind of, you know, almost can-do attitude. I mean, do you see that still very relevant today?
Definitely, yeah. That's one of the themes I picked up when I started thinking of creativity in terms of things like problem solving. And that's the thing of, you know, using the materials they have to hand. Quite often they don't have the right gear, so they have to make it out of something else. But yeah, particularly in the early days, it was amateurs in Australia that petitioned the government basically to start radio broadcasting, and they quite often, Charles McClure and 2CM, we were talking about that one this morning, Donald Helper mentioned him. There were regular amateur broadcasts. This was on the medium wave band before amateurs got moved up to shortwave. They'd be broadcasting music and regular programs so that there was something for people to listen to. And in a way, they were like the bloggers on social media. They developed followings and things like that. So they were trying to share their enthusiasm with other people, and they provided a lot of regular content. And many amateur radio operators took up licenses as well. Here in my hometown of Toowoomba, we have 4GR, which is the oldest commercial station in Queensland, and that was started by a fellow named Ted Gold. It was Gold Radio, 4GR. He was an amateur who had a station in his home house. And when commercial licenses came out, he just sort of got a commercial license and started broadcasting from his home. And that's a fairly common story too. There were a lot that went into you sort of between the two. And Jock's written on the Empire early. Just can't think of his name. The fellow from AWA. I've just had a mental blank. But
Fisk.
Yeah,
Fisk. Thank you. So Fisk, you know, and all these amateur experimenters, they all work together. You know, so he was with the Marconi Company, and then later as Amalgamated Wireless, and they're all sort of. There was a lot of blurring between, you know, commercial and amateur in the early days.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we are at 1 minute past 3. I feel like almost saying time to check the traffic and go to weather. But we won't. But what it is time is to grab your coffee mug and go and get yourself a cup of tea or coffee and drop out of this session, but come back in for our next session starting at 3:15. And then that will be through into our panel discussion. So, Andrew, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for being here.
Can I just thank everybody for coming along and listening to me ramble on? Thank you very much for coming along to my talk. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you at 3:15 in the next room.